instantly staking claim in the center. This thrust opens diagonals for the queen and bishop while preparing for rapid development. Embracing the Sicilian, black immediately challenges white's central ambition and crafts a dynamic, asymmetric battleground. Initiating development, this knight aims to contest the center and prepare for pawn advances, creating harmonious piece play. Securing the pawn center and preparing for a dynamic Sicilian structure, this move opens diagonal lines for the bishop. Opening the center is a bold bid for rapid development and attacking potential. Opening the center and immediately challenging white's pawn structure grants black initiative, demanding precise piece placement. Unleashing the knight to the center, white immediately stakes a claim and prepares to develop other pieces efficiently. Challenging the central knight aggressively, this develops a piece, aiming for immediate activity and counterplay. Developing the knight here secures the center and prepares for queenside expansion, hinting at potential pressure along the c-file. Preparing the b5 pawn push, a common Sicilian idea, aims to gain queenside space and disrupt white's knight. Securing the knight's advanced position from potential, bg4 harassment sets up a more flexible development scheme for the kingside pieces, potentially aiming for a swift kingside pawn storm or reinforcing the center without immediate tactical worries. Developing the bishop to a fianchetto creates a powerful long-range diagonal, putting pressure on white's queenside and preparing for castling. Aggressively pushing the kingside pawns creates immediate weaknesses while seeking to cramp black's development and potentially launch a swift attack. Be mindful of the king's safety, as this pawn storm can open lines for counterplay. The bishop, now unhindered by its pawn, anchors itself on this long diagonal, surveying the queenside and preparing to contest the d4 square's influence. Aggressively pushing the g-pawn creates immediate tension on the kingside, aiming to disrupt black's developing harmony and potentially restrict the bishop's scope. This pawn advance, while gaining space, also opens up the king's defenses, demanding careful calculation from white to ensure it doesn't become a liability later on. It's a bold statement, signaling an intention to seize the initiative and dictate the game's direction. A bold repositioning of the knight, aiming to disrupt white's aggressive pawn structure on the kingside, though it temporarily sacrifices central control and exposes the d7 pawn. Developing the bishop to an active square, this move prepares castling and begins to exert influence on the d4-h8 diagonal, potentially targeting black's king position later on. Opening up the e-file and challenging white's central pawn, mass immediately creates a dynamic imbalance, forcing a reassessment of white's pawn structure and potential attacking avenues. Repositioning the knight to a less exposed square allows for a potential kingside attack, while also preparing for future central pawn pushes. A daring knight repositioning, aiming to disrupt white's central pawn structure and create attacking chances on the kingside, though it leaves the f4 square vulnerable and potentially allows white to gain space on the queenside. Unleashing an assault on the kingside, the bishop's repositioning aims to pry open lines and exploit the knight's slightly awkward placement on f4. Unlocking potential, the knight embarks on a central quest, challenging the established d4 pawn and preparing to pivot towards the kingside, potentially reinforcing the g6 advance and creating a new attacking dynamic. Targeting the f6 knight with the knight's displacement to d5 creates a fascinating positional puzzle, potentially forcing black into a difficult decision regarding the advanced knight's fate and the subsequent structural compromises. Castling securely anchors the king and brings the rook into play, a crucial step for black amidst white's aggressive pawn advances. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, white aggressively pushes forward, aiming to pry open lines against the castled king. This advance contests the crucial g-file and threatens to create outpost squares for white's knights, while also potentially cramping black's queenside maneuvering. The long-term implications for king's safety and piece activity will be immense, forcing black to confront this immediate spatial challenge. Relinquishing the powerful bishop for a knight dramatically alters the pawn structure, potentially opening lines for your king's safety and creating dynamic imbalances. Unleashing the queen now, targeting the f6 knight and simultaneously preparing to exploit the opened kingside files, forces black into a defensive posture where knight activity is severely restricted. Snapping off the central knight immediately simplifies the position, but also opens the d-file for white's queen and potentially frees the f-pawn for a later advance. Black's king appears safer for now, sheltered behind the pawn chain, yet this exchange fundamentally alters the pawn structure and the nature of the queenside battle that was brewing. Opening the e-file opens up lines for both rooks and potentially exerts pressure on black's queenside if development continues conventionally. White is now better placed to challenge the d-pawn in the future, and the doubled pawns on the d-file, though unusual, also create an interesting dynamic, potentially acting as a shield for the king or a lever for pawn breaks. The board has simplified somewhat, but the strategic battle for central control, particularly around the d5 square, is just beginning. Black needs to be mindful of white's potential pawn advances and ensure their pieces are harmoniously placed to counter any threats. Bailing out of the pawn chain's tension, black steers the knight towards a defensive outpost. This repositioning aims to reinforce the center and prepare for a potential queenside expansion, offering a strategic retreat while seeking to improve knight placement. The knight's journey to e7 signifies a desire to solidify the kingside and potentially link up with other pieces for future operations. It's a subtle maneuver to regain equilibrium after white's aggressive pawn advances. This maneuver skillfully creates a protected passed pawn on the d5 square, a dangerous outpost that restricts black's development and poses immediate threats. Black's rook surges onto the open file, immediately contesting central influence and creating dynamic potential on the c-file, threatening to unravel white's pawn structure if not addressed with precision. Developing the bishop to its active diagonal opens up the c-file for potential infiltration and allows the queen to support advances on the kingside, creating a cohesive attacking front, while the knight on f4 remains somewhat isolated. Black bravely ventures b5, a dynamic pawn thrust aimed at immediately challenging white's cramped queenside and potentially opening lines for the queenside pieces. This decision injects dynamism, forcing white to consider how to respond to the encroaching threat. The long-term implications of this pawn push could lead to a complex positional battle, where control of the queenside will be heavily contested. A bold declaration of intent, castling kingside to secure safety and immediately launch an assault on the queenside, though it leaves the king slightly exposed to potential future knight maneuvers on the d-file. A bold attempt to seize the initiative on the queenside, this move aims to disrupt white's king safety and potentially open lines for counterplay, though it sacrifices immediate central influence. Initiating a strategic retreat, the queen pivots to the kingside, creating potential pressure on the c-file and freeing the bishop to participate in the central struggle, while simultaneously reinforcing the weakened d5 pawn and preparing for a potential pawn storm on the kingside if black commits to an aggressive pawn push. Black aims to activate the queen, connecting rooks and potentially eyeing the c3 knight, while also preparing for future pawn advances on the queenside to contest white's queenside space advantage. Initiating a fascinating maneuver, white repositions the knight to d2, aiming to bolster the central pawn structure and prepare for potential pawn advances on the kingside or queenside. The knight's relocation subtly alters the dynamic, potentially unblocking the bishop on c1 for a future diagonal assault. This defensive reinforcement, however, might also signal a desire to contest control of key central squares and prepare for a positional squeeze. Consider the immediate implications. The d5 pawn now feels more secure, and the knight on d2 offers flexibility for both attacking and defensive roles. Furthermore, this redeployment avoids potential tactical skirmishes on the f3 square, keeping options open. Seizing the initiative, black boldly pushes the pawn to e4, disrupting white's kingside pawn structure and creating immediate tactical possibilities while also contesting the central squares and potentially opening lines for their pieces. Liberating the queen to c7 opens up attacking possibilities on the queenside, aiming to exploit the d-file and potentially support an advance of the queenside pawns. Gaining control of the file with the rook, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially launch an attack against the c2 pawn. Reorienting the king to the safer queenside diagonal offers a touch of prophylaxis, subtly preparing for potential complications arising from black's active rook and pawn thrusts, while also potentially freeing up the d-file should the opportunity arise later. Black injects a dynamic pawn threat, aiming to disrupt white's queenside structure and potentially liberate the knight trapped on f5. This aggressive push, though seemingly simple, initiates a fascinating positional skirmish, potentially leading to a complex material imbalance or a dramatic shift in initiative if white isn't vigilant. Cementing central control, this pawn advance aims to restrict black's active pieces, particularly the knight on f5, and solidify white's pawn structure, setting up a potential queenside expansion or a more fortified kingside. The rook's redeployment to c8 isn't about immediate conflict, but rather establishing a more robust defensive posture along the open file, preparing to contest it more effectively should white decide to push further on the queenside. Reinforcing the central pawn chain while offering a subtle retreat for the rook, white aims to consolidate his space and prepare for potential breakthroughs. The rook's infiltration to the queenside via the fourth rank presents an intriguing strategic dilemma, threatening to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the queenside if not addressed. Securing the queenside pawn structure by advancing the pawn aims to prevent black's queenside expansion and to create a potential avenue for future queenside play, while also defending the b2 square. An attempt to create active counterplay, this piece seeks to utilize the now open e-file and potentially attack the white kingside while simultaneously solidifying black's queenside presence. It subtly aims to disrupt white's planned expansion on the queenside, forcing a reaction and questioning the soundness of the previous pawn push. Unleashing a pawn storm on the kingside, white aims to shatter black's defensive structure and expose the monarch. This aggressive advance creates immediate tactical threats, forcing black to react defensively rather than continuing their own queenside expansion. The pawn on h5 now eyes the f6 square and potentially g6, aiming to pry open lines towards the black king. A fascinating positional maneuver, 26. Ni seeks to reroute the knight to potentially more active squares, perhaps targeting d5 or even f5 again, while simultaneously defending the e-pawn which is currently under scrutiny. This knight's journey is crucial for bolstering black's central pawn structure and preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm or a defensive reinforcement of the queenside. It's a subtle yet vital repositioning, aiming to escape the pin and prepare for future offensive or defensive endeavors, a true test of black's tactical foresight and positional understanding against white's aggressive pawn push on the kingside. Opening a file here aggressively seeks to expose the black king, trading pawn structure for attacking potential. Be mindful of the delicate balance between pressure and creating weaknesses for yourself. Opening a diagonal for your queen to potentially penetrate the kingside, this capture also strategically prepares for a future fight for the h-file, though it does invite white's pawn to advance further and potentially gain space. The pawn advance on c4 opens a pathway for the queen to potentially infiltrate on the queenside, while also challenging black's control of that sector and preparing for a potential d5 push to gain space. Seeking to untangle its pieces from white's tightening grip, black aims to activate the queen, eyeing potential threats along the open files and preparing for a dynamic regrouping to challenge white's central dominance. Opening the c-file, this pawn grab dramatically alters the structural landscape, aiming to expose the black queen and disrupt any comfortable placement she might have on the queenside. The immediate consequence is a direct confrontation, a challenging of black's defenses on an open line, forcing an immediate decision regarding the exposed rook and queen. The sudden exchange on the first rank seizes the open file, fundamentally altering the immediate battleground and forcing white to reconsider their central control and how to regroup their forces under newfound pressure. Exploiting the open file is paramount. The rook's repositioning to the first rank immediately challenges black's queen and creates an immediate threat of further pressure along the entire column. Seizing the open queen's file offers a tantalizing immediate prospect, but a deeper look reveals it invites immediate trouble as the queenside suddenly becomes exposed to a coordinated attack. The queens are exiting the stage, initiating a shift towards potential endgame complexities where pawn structure and piece activity will dictate the flow. The board simplifies dramatically, and this exchange of queens ushers in a new strategic phase where black must carefully navigate the open files and the exposed nature of the white king. Introducing a new attacker to the queen side, the rook now infiltrates along the 7th rank, creating immediate pressure on black's pawns and potentially forcing concessions in pawn structure. Attempting to re-establish material equality by snatching the pawn creates a double-edged situation, as the exposed knight now becomes a prime target for white's active pieces, particularly the rook now eyeing the 7th rank. Securing the 7th rank with the rook presents a clear objective, aiming to disrupt black's coordinated pieces and potentially create pawn weaknesses on the queen side. Hoping to reactivate the bishop's dormant potential, black attempts to free the piece from its pawn entanglement, aiming to contest the now open b-file and potentially create tactical opportunities against white's isolated rook and pawn structure. Opening the b-file with the bishop exchange suddenly transforms the queen side into a battlefield, creating immediate pressure on black's isolated pawns and potentially forcing a difficult decision for the defense. The knights return to a more active central square, recapturing the pawn and setting up potential attacks on white's weakened kingside pawn structure and isolated d-pawn, signals a shift towards more dynamic play. This maneuver skillfully exploits the open files and the slightly exposed white king, hinting at future complications and possibly a re-evaluation of the pawn deficit. Securing the isolated pawn and initiating a decisive endgame maneuver, this rook grab actively contests the crucial central files now that the material is reduced. Reinforcing the central pawn chain with d5 is a logical step, aiming to solidify black's pawn structure and prevent white from easily exploiting the queenside. However, it might also create a slight weakness on c6 if white can ever exert pressure there, and it does commit black's central pawns, potentially limiting future flexibility. Pivoting the knight to a more central outpost threatens to disrupt black's recently established defensive pawn chain, potentially opening lines for attack or creating crucial weaknesses in the pawn structure. Shifting the king to the f8 square is a wise repositioning, actively securing the monarch and preparing to bring the rook into play from the d-file, aiming to contest the open file that will inevitably arise. Steering the knight towards the queen side opens up avenues for pawn breaks and potential outposts, a subtle shift in focus from the central struggle to controlling the broader board. Navigating the board's tension, this retreat offers a momentary respite, but the real challenge lies in coordinating the rooks for future action, particularly on the open files, before white's knight finds more influential squares. Establishing a queenside presence, the rook on a4 now becomes a target, forcing black to decide its fate and potentially opening avenues for white's rook on the 7th rank. Securing the rook's outpost at b7 was paramount, but a misplaced knight now dreams of glory on the kingside, ignoring the precarious d5 pawn that's about to become white's sole focus. Seizing the opportunity to restrict black's knight and force a more favorable pawn structure, white's pawn advance probes for weaknesses and aims to create outposts while also limiting the enemy's active pieces. Seizing upon the open kingside diagonal, this piece ventures into enemy territory aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create tactical complications around the weak king. Unlocking the h-file's potential opens a direct assault route, transforming the rook into a potent weapon poised for immediate action. The king's path to safety is suddenly exposed as the pawns surrounding it crumble under relentless pressure, creating a desperate scramble to fend off the encroaching material. A powerful discovered check. This sacrifice rips open the black king's defenses and forces an immediate reaction, completely disrupting any lingering coordination black might have hoped to achieve. The king's desperate scramble towards the queen side, aiming to escape the looming threat of the rook and pawn passed on the queen side, signals a perilous endgame transition where active king participation is paramount for survival. The rook's repositioning to the open file aims to create immediate pressure on the opponent's king, forcing a decisive confrontation as black's defenses are already somewhat strained. Pushing the pawn forward, black aims to create a passed pawn and disrupt white's knight coordination, hoping to gain some momentum after a series of exchanges that left the material somewhat simplified. A bold repositioning of the knight towards the center aims to disrupt black's pawns and potentially target the vulnerable e3 pawn, while also creating space for white's own pieces to maneuver more freely, hinting at a shift towards a more active endgame strategy. A desperate attempt to inject life into a losing position, this pawn thrust ignores the encroaching white king and the open lines that threaten black's already compromised defenses.